Tonight, I'm going to make a claim that sounds outrageous until you see the machine behind it. Iran's latest move is not a reaction. It's a phase transition. The Israel conflict has crossed an invisible line, away from a shadow war you can compartmentalize and into a systemic confrontation you cannot unsee, unbuild, or roll back. And I'm not asking you to take that on faith. In the next few minutes, I'm going to give you a 4-stage mechanism that repeats across history like a fingerprint. Then I'll prove it 3 times with hard examples. And then, this is the part you need to stay for, I'll run the present through the same machine step by step, like a checklist, until the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Here's the shocking part. What looks like diplomacy, threats, and sporadic strikes is not chaos. It's the predictable output of a pressure system that has been assembling for years, financially, militarily, politically, like a fuse you can measure. And here's the statistic that should make your stomach drop. By late 2025, global debt was reported near $7 trillion. A scale of leverage so enormous it doesn't just shape markets, it shapes wars, alliances, and the tolerance of governments for instability. Now pair that with this. World military spending hit a record too, $18 trillion. In 2024, the steepest rise in decades. That's not a background detail. That's the sound of the entire planet buying insurance against the future, because the future feels less controllable. So when Iran steps the way it just stepped, showing up to Oman-mediated talks with the United States while narrowing the agenda, defining the terms, and hardening the frame, this is not improvisation. It's what happens when a geopolitical engine hits a specific RPM and the gears must shift. And I need you to understand the inevitability here, because the most dangerous lie in global affairs is the same lie people tell themselves in collapsing markets. This is temporary, this is unique, this will calm down. No, the pattern we're watching is ancient. It repeats because it's structural. And once the inputs are in place, the outputs become mathematically inevitable. Here is the mechanism. 4 stages, not a theory, an operating system. Stage 1, the setup. A new security architecture forms after a shock, war, revolution, terror, collapse. Lines are drawn, guarantees are made, taboos are declared. Everyone believes the architecture will stabilize the world because everyone is exhausted and wants stability. Stage 2, expansion and overextension. The architecture works for a while, so actors expand inside it. They build networks, they fund proxies, they borrow against the future. They assume deterrence will hold. Every player pushes the boundary because the boundary appears to move without punishment. Stage 3, crisis and loss of control. A trigger exposes that the architecture cannot absorb stress anymore. The cost of holding the system together spikes. Leaders start making moves to avoid being trapped. Moves that look contradictory but are actually survival. Diplomacy becomes coercive. Warfare becomes messaging. Everyone plays chicken with escalation ladders. Stage 4, the inevitable outcome. The system resolves in one of 2 ways, sometimes both. A new order is forced through direct confrontation, or a new order is forced through formal bargaining after a near miss. The old rules don't return. Even if there's a ceasefire, the baseline has changed. The map of what's possible expands permanently. If you're skeptical, good. Because now I'm going to prove it. Not storytelling, proof. Case 1, Europe after World War I. Setup, 1918. The war ends. Europe is shattered. Empires fracture. The post-war settlement tries to freeze a new status quo. Borders, reparations, demilitarization, accountability narratives. The Treaty of Versailles is not just paperwork. It's an attempt to program a continent. People want to believe it will prevent the next catastrophe because the alternative is unthinkable. Expansion and overextension, but the settlement creates a pressure chamber. Reparations, humiliation, territorial rearrangements, and fragile new states produce incentives to test boundaries. Germany strains economically and politically. France wants enforcement. Britain wants balance. America retreats from deep commitments, and the financial layer becomes the amplifier. Interlocking war debts, reparation schedules, and international lending build dependence and resentment. The system looks stable, but its stability built on leveraged expectations. Crisis and loss of control. Triggers arrive. Early 1920s, hyperinflation in Germany. Political violence. Then, the Great Depression detonates trade and employment. Suddenly, the cost of preserving the post-war order becomes intolerable. Democratic coalitions fracture, extremists rise. And here's the key. The crisis doesn't cause the next war like a lightning bolt. It reveals the architecture was already brittle, and once brittleness is visible, actors start moving to escape the trap. Rearmament and revisionism accelerate because waiting feels more dangerous than acting. Inevitable outcome. The system does not return to 1919 rules. It resets through catastrophe, World War II. Then a redesigned architecture, United Nations, NATO, Bretton Woods institutions, nuclear deterrence. The old order doesn't get patched, it gets replaced. Remember this, in systemic transitions, the outcome is not calm. The outcome is new baseline. Case 2, Vietnam and the collapse of Bretton Woods. Set up after World War II, the world builds a new architecture. The US becomes the anchor of security and finance. Bretton Woods creates a dollar-centered monetary system. The dollar is linked to gold. Alliances form under a security umbrella. The promise is stability. Expansion and overextension, then expansion. The US commits globally, bases, Cold War competition, and Vietnam. Domestically, spending expands. Internationally, dollars flow out. Here's the hidden engine. When the reserve currency issuer expands commitments faster than confidence can sustainably support, it borrows credibility from the future. Dollars pile up overseas. Gold backing becomes a constraint. The system still works until the math catches up. Crisis and loss of control. Foreign holders start converting dollars to gold. Confidence frays. Inflation rises. And in 1971, the Nixon shock ends convertibility, effectively dismantling Bretton Woods. That isn't just policy, it's the architecture admitting it cannot keep its promise under the weight of expansion. The crisis echoes, stagflation, oil shocks, and a remapping of global assumptions. Inevitable outcome. A new order forms, floating exchange rates, new central bank behaviors, a restructured link between money and power. Again, the old fixed system doesn't return. New baseline. Case 3, the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. Set up post-World War II, the USSR becomes a superpower with a security sphere, ideology, alliance system. The architecture promises permanence, party control, planned economy, security state, expansion and overextension. The USSR expands its commitments, supporting allied regimes, competing militarily, projecting influence. The 1979 invasion of Afghanistan becomes a commitment trap. The security logic expands into terrain that consumes resources and legitimacy. Meanwhile, the economy strains, inefficiency, stagnation, dependence on commodity revenues, hidden costs of empire. Crisis and loss of control. Afghanistan bleeds the system. External pressure increases. Revenue volatility hits. Reforms, perestroika, glasnost, are not strength, they're pressure valves. But once a system signals it can't hold its own rules, every subordinate actor begins planning for the next order. National movements strengthen. Elite cohesion fractures, narrative control slips, inevitable outcome, dissolution, borders shift, alliances reconfigure new baseline, 3 different systems, same machine, setup, expansion, crisis, outcome. Now we apply it to the present, coldly, systematically. And I'm going to use the language of confirmation on purpose, because this isn't about vibes, it's about structure. First, we define the latest move correctly, not as one headline, but as a combined signal. Iran entering high-stakes talks in Oman with the United States, while insisting the agenda stay narrowly restricted to the nuclear program, rejecting expansion into missiles or regional proxies, happening under the shadow of major escalation, threats, and direct actions around the nuclear file and the Israel-Iran confrontation. If you think this is about peace, you're already behind. This is about reframing the conflict from a battlefield contest into an architecture contest. Who gets to set the rules of the next regional order? Now watch the stages lock in. Setup. What architecture formed? Start post-2003 fragmentation. Accelerate through the Arab Spring, Syria, the rise and degradation of ISIS territorial control. The normalization era, where some Arab states moved closer to Israel. Layer in the Iran nuclear file. Sanctions, proxy networks, and intermittent diplomacy. What emerges is an unstable architecture, where the United States is a security backstop but increasingly selective. Israel has tactical dominance but faces multi-front pressure. Iran builds a deterrence network through partners and capabilities, and Gulf states hedge between security dependence and economic modernization. And for years, this architecture worked in one grim sense. The conflict stayed deniable. Covert strikes, proxy exchanges, cyber operations, pressure without formal war. The shadow war stayed in the shadows. Setup, check. Expansion and overextension, now the boundary pushing. Iran expands deterrence through missiles, drones, and regional partners. Israel expands its doctrine of preemption and what it calls the campaign between wars, continuous disruption to prevent enemies from hardening capabilities. The Idus II expands sanctions and episodic military actions while signaling domestic fatigue for open-ended commitments. And then the global layer tightens the vice. In a world carrying extreme leverage, prolonged instability becomes more expensive politically and economically. Governments face cost of living pressure. Investors price risk faster. Shipping disruptions ripple. Energy risk premiums spike. Global debt near 345. $7 trillion means many states are managing legitimacy on borrowed time. And remember the second number, world military spending at record highs. That's not defense, that's anticipation. It's the system telling you it expects more shocks, not fewer. In expansion, each actor learns something lethal. You can push the line and often win a small advantage without immediate punishment. That is how overextension becomes normal. Verified. Crisis and loss of control. Here is the pivot, the reason Iran's move matters. Crisis is when the shadow architecture can't absorb stress and events jump levels. Covert becomes overt. Deniable becomes declared. Limited becomes regional. The system starts producing paradox moves. Threats plus talks, escalation plus negotiation, strikes plus denials, because everyone is trying to avoid being the one who gets trapped in the wrong baseline. And this is exactly what we're seeing, US. Like Kiev, Iran talks are happening in the shadow of direct escalation, with Iran trying to restrict the agenda while the region carries the aftershock of major actions tied to the nuclear file. Now ask the question that reveals the machine. Why would Iran harden its position, insisting talks be limited while showing up at all? Because in crisis, rational actors do two things simultaneously. They signal they can absorb pain so the other side cannot exploit weakness, and they probe for an exit ramp so they aren't forced into a catastrophic trajectory where every next move is worse than the last. That is not peace talk behavior. That is crisis management under pressure behavior. It's diplomacy as battlefield geometry, undeniable. And here's the retention critical idea you must hold on to now, because it predicts what comes next. In stage 3, the true target is not the next strike. The true target is the next rule. Because every actor fears the same thing, being the one who waits while the other side changes the baseline. Israel fears waiting allows Iran's leverage to harden. Iran fears waiting invites strategic rollback, decapitation strategies, internal destabilization, permanent deterrence erosion. The U. S fears a regional war it can't fully control, but also fears deterrence credibility collapse if red lines look optional. So they stop playing yesterday's game and start playing tomorrow's architecture. That is what Iran's move signals. Tehran believes the next phase is being set now, and it wants a seat at the table not to surrender, but to constrain what the next order can legally, politically, and militarily become. Now we hit stage 4, the inevitable outcome. This is the part people resist, because it removes comforting ambiguity. In the outcome phase, the system resolves into a new baseline. That baseline can come in a hot form, wider direct confrontation, or formal form, an agreement that codifies red lines after a near miss. Often, it's both. Conflict to force terms to freeze gains, but in both cases, the old shadow rules do not return. That's the shift. The Israel conflict is no longer contained inside proxy deniability. It is being renegotiated at the level of regional architecture. If talks proceed, even partially, the outcome isn't peace. The outcome is a new baseline, clearer red lines, new enforcement logic, new alliance behavior, new defense postures, and a permanent expansion of what each side believes is permissible. If talks fail, the outcome is still a new baseline, a wider confrontation logic where deterrence becomes more brittle and thresholds lower. Either branch leads to the same structural conclusion. The old phase is over. Check. Now, I want to make this practical by giving you a way to watch the next months like an analyst instead of a headline addict. Here are the signals of stage 4 forming, and you can track them without inside sources. 1. Agendas get narrower, not wider. When actors insist, we will only discuss X, it's because X is the bottleneck variable. It's the key that changes the entire machine. 2. Red lines become public, repetitive, and ritualized. Because red lines are not just warnings, they are the scaffolding of the coming order. 3. Moves become theatrical. Not because they're fake, because they're communicative. Warfare becomes messaging to multiple audiences, enemies, allies, domestic populations, and markets. 4. Everyone talks about restraint while increasing preparedness. That is not hypocrisy. That is crisis behavior, the system trying to vent pressure without shattering. And the global numbers amplify all of it. Debt at that scale reduces patience. Record military spending raises capability and risk. The world becomes less tolerant of managed chaos and more prone to forcing resolution. Now, a final warning. Because this is where audiences usually drift into comforting myths. People say, technology will save us. No, it accelerates stages, it does not cancel them. People say, the region has seen escalations before. Yes, and the pattern says escalations are how the system tests whether it can expand without breaking. The question is when a test becomes a break. People say they don't want a full war. Intent does not override structure. In every case study, leaders wanted advantage without collapse. The system didn't care. So here is your actionable takeaway, not a slogan, a mental move. Stop analyzing this conflict as isolated events. Start analyzing it as a stage-based system: setup, expansion, crisis, outcome. When you do that, you stop being surprised by contradictions, because contradictions are how crisis systems breathe. And if you want one sentence to carry with you, make it this: the next headlines won't be random. They'll be negotiations over the next baseline, disguised as fights over the present, because the people who get hurt in systemic transitions are not the ones who lack opinions. They're the ones who don't recognize the stage they're standing in until the outcome arrives and the old rules never come back. So here's what I want you to do now. If you want to understand how the machine was built, how debt pressure, deterrence geometry, alliance hedging, and escalation ladders create inevitable outcomes, subscribe. And watch the next video, because I'm going to show you the most important part nobody explains clearly, and what the next baseline could look like, who benefits from it, and the exact warning signs that tell you Stage 4 has begun before the world admits it out loud.